Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Abigail. I'm from Freedom of the Press Foundation. I'm a program manager for the Source Protection Program, which we do in collaboration with the CIJ, and a co-organizer for this symposium's programming. James Baldwin, the great American writer and civil rights activist, once wrote, "The artist cannot and must not take anything for granted, but must drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides." These words seem equally applicable to journalism. Baldwin, a journalist himself, wrote often about this imperative of artists and the art's revelatory role in society. As an artist who works in journalism myself, I am honored to introduce this afternoon's panel on adapting journalism, which will celebrate and interrogate each speaker's innovative works that have blurred the lines between narrative art and investigations. We are joined by Calle Fuhr, a theater maker who creates investigative plays with journalists, Bradley Hope, the co-founder of the multimedia journalism studio Project Brazen, Sacha Pfeiffer, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning work with the Boston Globe was adapted into the Academy Award-winning film Spotlight, and our host, Robert Evans, an author, former Bellingcat journalist, and host of the podcasts Behind the Bastards and It Could Happen Here. Robert, over to you.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. So one thing we all have to accept as journalists today is that good traditional fact-checked print AP-style journalism reporting doesn't have the same hitting power it used to. It's been 20 years since the Boston Globe's Spotlight team won their well-deserved Pulitzer. It's been 50 years since Woodward and Bernstein wrote President Nixon out of office. But today, I have trouble imagining any piece of traditional reporting having a comparable impact on entities as powerful as the Roman Catholic Church or a Republican president. The reasons for this are multitude and complex, but we who call ourselves journalists must live with the reality. Fewer people trust what we used to call the media than at any time prior in our lives. Simultaneously, there exists a more urgent need for good journalism than ever before. I don't know where we go from here, but I do know that we can't cut through this Gordian knot with the same tools we used in the past. The task ahead of us now is to find new ways of reporting the news, of forcing truth on people who may not want to hear it, and in a world full of political systems hostile to facts. We must find a way to make journalism kinetic again, to bolster the old tools of our trade with something that gives them hitting power. I'm proud to be here today with a group of journalists who are willing to experiment, to reach beyond the AP format and try new ways of reaching audiences and making the truth matter. I anticipate a wide-ranging discussion today on different paths to doing just that, but I want to start our conversation by talking a little bit about someone who came before us, a journalist and poet I quite admire named Muriel Rukeyser. Now, Rukeyser was a lot of things in her life, a labor activist, a reporter. She worked on the early stages of reporting the Spanish-American War. But in 1936, she went to West Virginia to report on the worst industrial accident in U.S. history, the Hawk's Nest tunnel disaster. Reports had started to come out of the town of Calle Bridge of huge numbers of laborers stricken with silicosis, a fast-moving lung disease that they had contracted after helping Union Carbide build an underground tunnel as part of a hydroelectric project. Union Carbide cut corners. Management exhibited a sociopathic disregard for the wellness of hundreds of black migrant mine workers who were desperate for any way to support their family. Black laborers were forced at gunpoint to work. They were denied breaks. They were denied breathing equipment that company executives refused to enter the tunnel without. Many died within the first year, choked to death on the rotting refuse of their own lungs. The official death toll is likely between 700 and potentially over 1,000 people. The realities of the Depression and the fact that most of the affected laborers were poor and essentially homeless means that a full accounting will never be possible. The best attempt at it was the work Rukeyser wrote after her trip to Calle Bridge. The Book of the Dead is a collection of 20 poems strung together to present a coherent apocalyptic narrative of Union Carbide's cruelty and the suffering of its abused workforce. Rukeyser weaves the direct text of interviews with miners and their families alongside quotes from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead and lines from the biblical story of Absalom. And I'd like to read you a tiny chunk of this poem, which I recommend picking up and reading in its entirety. Now, this is from a portion where she is relating the text in the form of a poem of an interview with a miner named Merle Blankenship. Dear Sir, my name is Merle Blankenship. I have worked for the Reinhardt and Dennis Company many days and many nights, and it was so dusty you couldn't hardly see the lights. I helped nip steel for the drills, and helped lay the track in the tunnel, and done lots of drilling near the mouth of the tunnel. And when the shots went off, the boss said, "If you are going to work, venture back." And the boss was Mr. Andrews, and now he is dead and gone. But I am still here, a-lingering along. So, that's my piece. I'm now excited to hear from our panelists about their thoughts on adapting investigative work in light of the new media environment that we're all living in and the, shall we say, crowded disinformation ecosystem that we all have to navigate. Sacha, I'd like to start with you. If you were working on the same story today, like essentially breaking it today in this very different media environment, how would you differently approach publishing and publicizing your work in order to best ensure a similar impact?
It was interesting that you mentioned in your introduction that you struggle to think about a project that could be done today that could have the same impact of projects in the past, because I think about that a lot. That one of the frustrations I think of our business today is we spend an enormous amount of time investigating very complicated things, and then we publish stories that I often think are really good and really revelatory, and then nothing happens. There's often a really big shrug, and I think a lot of us struggle to figure out, okay, what are other ways to bring attention to our stories? When we did our clergy sex abuse reporting in the early 2000s, we benefited from the very early era of the internet. So if that story had come out just a few years earlier, it would have only been read by people that got the Boston Globe delivered on their doorsteps, as quaint as that sounds. But because it was the internet, it was read not all over the country, but all over the world, which meant enormous numbers of tip calls started coming in, confirming and verifying what we had known and finding other clergy sex abuse victims around the country. But I think about that a lot. What could it have had the same impact today? And I cringe to think that maybe we would have done all that work. And because there's so much outrage fatigue now in society, would people have shrugged? I hope not. But I don't know that I have the exact answer for that, of what we would do differently, except obviously we would have to explore all the ways that you have to reach people today in whatever form they're in. I now work for NPR, National Public Radio in the US. It's sort of the BBC equivalent in the US. And like most of your media outlets, we have to have a presence everywhere there are people: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, online, Alexa. And it's very taxing on media outlets, especially when we're already very financially challenged. But I think the answer generally would be we have to find a way to meet people on every platform they're on, as obvious that answer sounds. But it's a big pressure on media outlets today, given that they're already struggling in some ways due to the very basic things they do.
Thank you. Calle, Fuhr, this next question is for you. The work you do adapting investigations into live performance is so much more intimate than written traditional reporting. How would you characterize the impact that it has on the audiences in your experience?
Thank you for the question. I think the biggest impact is that a little fire that might go out in the everyday life of Trump and what else happens all the time is lit up again. That people leave the shows and are like, we can change something because there are journalists doing exactly the same, fighting, even if the headline or the story itself is terrifying and frustrating, the story behind it becomes visible, that there are people like you working against huge repercussions. Do you say that? And still do the work. And I think that is something we have to tell people, because it gives hope, even if the news that comes out of it is scary.
Thank you so much for that. Bradley, I wanted to ask you, because you and I are both in podcasts, and narrative podcasts are one of the better ways of delivering journalism to a large audience today, but it comes with its own set of pitfalls. And I'm wondering kind of what you see as both the promise and pitfalls of narrative podcasts as a way of delivering journalism to people.
Well, I was very interested in podcasts initially because, having worked in print for so long, I never got to use a soundtrack to my reporting. And so that was the main incentive for me. I wanted to have sound effects and to have an emotional paintbrush, I think the main challenge is that in the marketplace for podcasts, so traditionally podcasts that are narrative are sold to buyers, and those buyers have suddenly stopped buying narrative podcasts. So I think the main problem is it's a very engaging format. People love it. And the amount of work that has to go into turning journalism into a narrative podcast is extraordinary. But there's not an economic alignment for how that works. So in our particular case, we self-publish our podcasts, and so we have to find our own resources to make them. But we don't monetize them directly the way that would make the most sense. I think there was a period of time where there was a big boom of that, but not anymore. So I think right now the world loves narrative podcasts, but there's not an economic model that currently works for that to proliferate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only way we've managed to do it over at Cool Zone is we have a large, very much non-journalistic podcast. It's effectively a humor podcast that subsidizes the limited run shows, because limited run shows almost can't make money. Every now and then you get like a serial scale hit or something, and those do, but the only way to really be consistently profitable is regular, like weekly shows that build an audience.
Could I add something to that?
Oh, yeah.
So
please.
NPR has a number of podcasts, obviously, and I know that our podcast division believes that in order for them to create enough revenue, they ideally should be daily. Mm-hmm. They, if not that, a few times a week, at a minimum weekly. But as you said, if they're just limited series, it's very hard to get advertisers and to build an audience. The last project that I did at the Boston Globe before I moved to NPR was about a U.S. NFL football player named Aaron Hernandez, who was a big star. He'd been accused of murder, sentenced to life in prison, killed himself in prison, and then they did an autopsy of his brain, and he was found to have the worst case of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, this repeated head trauma disease that is often found in football players, in a football player that young. That was later turned into a podcast series, and we partnered with a private podcast company to do that. And it helped us, but I wonder if you find this experience. It ended up becoming kind of a bit of a battle between facts and storytelling. The private company was much less concerned about whether things were correct and more about sounds and stories. So there was a lot more war behind the scenes than I think a lot of us were comfortable with. So I think that's a way to help, but it can be a pitfall of doing that.
Yeah, that's actually leads us into my next question. And I'll start with Calle, but I'm interested in everyone's take on this, which is obviously, you had a portion of your life dramatized in a film, and some of that was accurate, and some of that I'm sure was dressed up. Like, for example, I think most newsrooms, people's clothing is less well tailored. But in general, I'm curious for everyone's thoughts on what should the line be between journalistic rigor and artistic license when adapting work in this way, in various ways.
So I can tell you something about how we do it. Like, I work with Dossier, an independent news outlet from Austria, and Correctiv, also independent from Germany. And what we do, I write a script based on their investigations, and they fact check the script again and say, hey, you know what, this is something you can't just claim. And by, even if it sounds counterintuitive, fact-checking a theater script, we are kind of bulletproof, because of course there are people who tried to sue us, who sued us, and all the time they failed because we could say, hey, there's nothing in there that's not true. Maybe you don't like it, maybe you don't like the big stage you suddenly have, but we are safe. And this fact check we also make accessible to the public. We publish the script. We say that this is a theater performance, but the facts are all tight. And if you have doubts, you can just read it afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I find that fascinating. One of the pieces I'm better known for was a limited run series initially I did called It Could Happen Here, that was about the possibility of a civil conflict in the United States. And it was, the bulk of each episode was reporting from various parts of the world in, order to kind of set an idea of what conflicts look like in the 21st century. But every episode was introed by a fictional vignette, usually about a page, to try to put the listener in the head of someone living through a civil war, right? But within kind of a more familiar American context. And so, that's something that I found was very good at getting people in. It's certainly a less traditional approach. I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
I mean, I come down on the side of the rigor, which I guess for me means it will always be a bit of a war when I have to. I just can't let go of that, I guess, even though I realize there has to be an important storytelling element to it. But when it comes to getting flexible on what actually happened, I feel very uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, of course.
Well, from my point of view, so Project Brazen is actually very diverse in the way that we approach our first version of something. So we operate in print, we have podcasts, different kinds of podcasts. We also are involved in documentaries. So for us, we find a story that we want to tell, and the contours of that story dictates the format. So, one of my general principles is that in order to tell a story very well, your reporting has to be extraordinary. And I had this experience in writing books where you realize you couldn't tell a money flow diagram as a story. You have to explain the characters and the people around it. So I find if you really report something well, you often are given the tools to tell that story in a long form format. But you can't always fit everything as a podcast. This kind of classic narrative podcast with twists and turns can become very artificial sometimes. And so, that's why the reporting has to dictate the format, and that's a way to avoid this kind of compromise to some extent.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I think is harder to avoid are the parasocial dynamics that come particularly with podcasting. When you're talking in someone's ear on even a daily basis, that's a thing that is kind of new. It's certainly very different from traditional print reporting. I'm wondering if that's something either of you have kind of struggled with or have thought about in kind of an ethical dimension. Is the way in which this medium works has a different emotional impact on the listener than a lot of print journalism tends to.
You mean whether there can be something manipulative about that?
No. I mean whether it alters the feeling that someone knows you, which can start, especially if you're coming in as more of a host presenting other people's journalism. It's something that I've found very peculiar, right? The way people reach out to you as fans is different than I had experienced in print journalism previously. I imagine the fact that you've been adapted in a film, potentially there's a kind of fandom aspect that comes into that. Is that something you have experienced?
Yes, and it's very strange, especially when we're used to asking a lot of people questions, but often feel uncomfortable when we're being asked questions.
Yeah.
Although when I left the Boston Globe, I began working for an NPR member station. So NPR is the mothership, and then it has stations throughout the U.S. I started at a station, then I went to the mothership. At the station, I started as a reporter, and then I became the host who was on the air in the afternoon. I did not like that job very much because there was too much, for me, sort of headline reading and weather reports and not enough of the interviews that felt very substantial, especially because I had come from the Spotlight team where everything we did was so substantial. But being on the air in the afternoon made people think you were a local celebrity.
Yeah.
And for me, there was a very strange mismatch between feeling somewhat dissatisfied with the substance of my work, but for the outside world, the fact that they got to hear you. Anytime they can hear you or see you, it is this effect that I totally understand, but still find myself shocked.
Yeah. It's very peculiar. It's altered the way I've had to report because my show is particularly popular where I live. So showing up at a protests and whatnot and realizing that the number of people coming up to you, you are altering the dynamics of a situation that you're supposed to be reporting on and you shouldn't be altering.
Well, I also think, and this is probably relevant very much to the two of you, the apparatus of podcasting and broadcasting changes the relationship. When I was a print reporter, I could do my job largely by a telephone or with a notebook. When I moved to radio, I had to arrive with a huge amount of gear. It's been minimized now that iPhones and other devices are so good. But because I came from print, I was so conscious about how the presence of that microphone was changing the interview, changing the relationship. And I had to come up with ways to try to de-emphasize the presence of the equipment, which I'm sure is something two of you do quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Bradley, did you have a...
Yeah, I mean, I think what's nice about podcasts is that intimacy, that you're in someone's ear. And so it does foster a stronger connection. Unfortunately, I'm not as famous as you. So when I go somewhere, no one notices still. So
It's a blessing.
yeah, but so I don't alter any dynamics typically. But what I do believe that actually in journalism, it does help to have some, whether it's celebrity in this case or notoriety or whatever it might be, because it does kind of bring you more information. More people come to you with ideas. I mean, so for a long time, I hated doing any kind of public speaking as a journalist or go on TV or something. But the first time I did it, and then someone's like, hey, by the way, you should look into this. Then I sort of got my head around that it was actually quite useful.
Yeah, I have this. So I did after January 6th, 2021, reporting on the woman who stole Nancy Pelosi's laptop and revealed that she was a neo-Nazi activist. And the tip that came in that led to that story was a person who, at the same protest, they were a protester and they were next to me. I had my hand broken and they had their arm broken by two adjacent Proud Boys. And that's, so yeah, like sometimes you do get stories from that as well. Calle, I wanted to ask you, I'm fascinated by the experimental creativity of your approach. And I wonder though, are there types of reporting you wouldn't choose to adapt this way, or at least types of reporting that you've tried to adapt and found more challenging than others?
So I focus on two areas. One is the climate crisis. The other one is white-collar crime. And these are typically two areas that you wouldn't directly see on a theater stage, especially not the climate crisis. But because there is this huge need for stories to not only understand, but get a feeling for what is happening, I picked that, and what I found out is that when you start with, hey, I wanna tell something about the climate crisis, there are a lot of people, especially in journalists, who say, "Amazing, I have a story for you that might fit." And I think if you come in with such a wide range of topics, there will always be stories that can come onto stage, even if they are not like typically a thriller or something like that. So I think everything can come to stage.
Thank you. Bradley, do you have a kind of on the same topic, any feelings about like the sort of reporting you wouldn't want to cover on your show, or you wouldn't think that that would be the, an appropriate venue?
Well, I have a sort of controversial point of view and perhaps slightly perpendicular to a conference like this, which is after many years of working in newspapers, I came to the conclusion that the only thing I cared about was to truly engage with the audience first and foremost. And so I want to do that with my principles intact, but I'm only looking for stories that can be told in this long form narrative format. So when I read, for example, the work of the OCCRP, I deeply appreciate what they do, but I would personally, for what we do, stay away from trying to understand the mechanics of a kleptocracy, for example. What I would rather find is a story that reveals that in the process of telling another story in particular. So I think I stay away from what you would almost consider traditional investigative journalism unless I feel like I can have that impact. When I was at a newspaper, my number one statistic was always, did someone read the story from the beginning to the end? Because oftentimes they read the first few paragraphs, And so when you had an article that came out and it was engaged all the way to the end, that to me was the ultimate success. So that's the kind of story I'm looking for.
Can you give an example of something where you would think that way of telling it is too big, but here's how I would make it smaller and tellable?
Well, but we have a podcast we just put out now that's originally I was fascinated by this famous scandal called BCCI. I'm sure you remember this big global banking conspiracy case. And but as I tried to figure out how to tell that story, I just couldn't find a way in. So instead, we ironically did the story about this artist who portrayed it as a giant sort of Sistine Chapel, money flow diagram. And the story is focused on his life and how he came to be interested in that. And in the process, you also can tell the story of this scandal. But we didn't focus on the scandal itself.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Another question for everybody, as we're talking about getting experimental and very kind of different ways of looking at journalism, what do we consider our red lines after which we would say, like, if someone is doing this, I would not consider that something that deserves the kind of protections that a journalist can expect?
Well, I would say there's not really a red line per se, but as long as you're transparent in what you're doing, like you described earlier, you had a show that was intellectual based on the real world, but you used fictional vignettes. As long as the audience knows what they're getting, then that's still an effective nonfiction technique. But if you were to have said it was nonfiction when it was fiction, that would be a red line. That would be miscommunicating or not telling the truth. But I think I would be very open-minded about any kind of experimental approach someone has, so long as there's some element of transparency.
And as long as there are people who might go into a topic through this way that wouldn't otherwise, because that's also something we experience in theater, that people don't come because they are so interested in the topic that we deal with, but because they want to see the actress who's in it. And that is an amazing way to get people into new topics that I think is something we need more.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up kind of like showing your work and that being an important aspect of the rigor, behind an adaptation. What I found really interesting about Spotlight, the movie, is that it gets into a lot more of the actual nuts and bolts of putting together a story in a way that's kind of a black box to someone just reading the article.
Right. I've said this many times, but when we were approached by some producers saying they wanted to turn our work into a movie, and this was years after the project, I was very wary and thought it was a very bad idea. And my feeling was that just nothing good can come from getting involved in Hollywood. There are too many situations where people have felt burned. In some ways, honestly, I felt a little peer pressured to do it, but I also felt like this movie will never get made. It's an unpalatable topic, pre-sexually molesting boys, largely boys. Who would finance it? So to my great shock, this movie got made. And I was very concerned, even though I thought very highly of the screenwriter and the director. The movie that the screenwriter did previous to this was one that I didn't think was that great. And when I saw it in a theater, there was what I considered a completely ludicrous, absurd, unnecessary sex scene between two characters. When I walked out of the theater, I started to feel this sense of cold fear. And it was, oh my God, if he thought they needed a sex scene in that movie, maybe he's going to think they need a sex scene in our movie. And I was the only woman on the team. And at the time I was in my late 20s. And I just remember thinking, oh my God. So when we finally saw a screening of the movie, it wasn't there. And I just felt this wash of relief. And I had never wanted to mention this to the screenwriter or the director for fear of planting a seed, and that maybe if they weren't considering a sex scene, they would after I mentioned it. But when I told them that I felt relieved, they said to me that in Hollywood, it's quite typical to bring in someone called a script consultant, and you hand over your draft screenplay, and the script consultant returns it with notes. And their script consultant had said to them, we think this movie could use some romance or some sex or an affair, and how about an affair between Rachel McAdams and Mark Ruffalo, which were the characters played by me and my colleague, Mike Resendiz. And I remember thinking, this was not paranoia, it was a legitimate fear, and we dodged a bullet. So I guess my caution for anyone in this room would be, because the world of Hollywood and podcasting has realized that journalism provides a lot of stories. So they often come to us. In fact, NPR and The Globe and many other media outlets have offices whose job is to broker and negotiate screenplay, podcasting, movie deals. I would say be very careful about the contracts you write to try to protect yourself so that you can think of what kind of scene might I not want to be in, and is there a way to legally protect yourself from that? So I guess that would be my red line in a way.
Yeah, thank you. Calle, kind of on the same topic, because your plays dramatize maybe that's the wrong word, but show the actual like process of reporting the story too. Like that's something that you depict. What aspects of the journalistic process do you think are most crucial to show an audience?
First, what is not written, because there wasn't a document, because there wasn't a second or third source to strengthen the trust in journalistic work. I think that is one of the most important things. And the huge amount of work you have to get through to actually get to a point, you know, like all the documents that you scan that where nothing turns out. I think that is also really important to show the work and show that there are not, which is a cliche that I think is not only real in Germany, that there are people who maybe talk to 2 or 3 folks and then write their story. Of course, that is happening in some newspapers and magazines, but that is not the journalistic standards many people put up on themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Bradley, working in podcasts as we do necessitates a lot of Zoom interviews. That's not my preferred method of talking to a source, but it's something that is increasingly common and unfortunately increasingly necessary. What are some of the tactics you've developed to kind of adapt to that situation and still try to, you know, get the best interview and the best information that you can?
Yeah, I think, like you're saying, I would try to avoid it at all costs. I mean, sometimes it's inevitably required, but I almost would rather start there and then still follow up and do another interview in person. And your comment earlier about minimizing the equipment really resonates with me. And Zoom itself is like an intermediation that also has an effect in a similar way. But yeah, so I think, especially, I think in podcasting, the most successful podcasts are not a series of sit-down interviews. It's actually the best format for revealing your work and for taking somebody on the journey. So in all the best podcasts that I listen to generally are make you feel like you're along for the ride in some way, and they reveal the inner workings of it. And I think the key to that is not to be afraid of the different textures of audio that may come from that. So sometimes a podcast will have, you know, they clearly recorded a speakerphone on a desk rather than a Zoom, and that's fine. You like to hear that different levels of quality, but definitely the more it's done by Zoom, the worse it's going to be, for sure.
Yeah. It's a difficult like situation. I found particularly when covering like protest movements that one of the best things you can do is just show up for a period of time without a phone in your hand. You know, I usually have a notebook, but without it, your eyes constantly in it, just kind of be observing. And it's almost like putting a fish in a bag inside a tank, right? To get acclimated to the community that you're reporting on, in order to kind of reduce some of those inherent barriers that people have to talking to the press in situations like that. I am curious, Calle, do you, because obviously a play, when you're doing something like that, there's a comparatively smaller audience size than you have to an article going out over the internet, to a podcast. What are some ways that you've explored to kind of represent or get your work out to more people than can fit in, you know, a room?
You know, I would question that, because I think there's, like Mr. Logan talked about, the echo chamber, where so many exclusive stories are read by a really exclusive part of society. And the size of the audience doesn't matter too much to me if it is people who understand something new. Mm-hmm. Plus, we have 800 people in our theater in Vienna, 20 shows, 30 shows per production. I think that is quite a lot of people from a city, from people coming to Vienna to see that. And I think I don't even, like, I wouldn't even go into maybe making a movie out of it afterwards to reach even more, because these 90, 120 minutes people spend together in a room experiencing that live is something so much bigger than the amount of people watching something.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're saying it would lose something essential to what makes it valuable if you were like putting it on YouTube or whatever.
Yeah, because in theater we have the privilege of the undivided attention. When it's on YouTube, when it's a podcast, when it's a movie. I mean, there's this phrase Netflix producers use. It has to be second screen adaptable, which means that you need to have a show that you can watch while you are on the phone chatting. And in theater, we have not the second screen, nor the first screen. We just have real people, and that is so powerful.
Yeah, because that's one of the, if I was thinking of pitfalls of podcasting, one of the biggest ones is that people tend to listen to them when they're driving to work, cleaning their dishes, working in the garden. And I do find when I talk to listeners about like what they got out of things, they'll often say, well, you didn't bring this up, or I was curious about that. No, we did. You were just talking to your kid during that 3-minute portion of the episode or something. I'm wondering, is that something that you've noticed and try to kind of, because I find myself adapting and repeating things in order to attempt to overcome that.
Yeah, when I transitioned from a newspaper to radio, that was one of my shocks, is that, with newspapers, people obviously can keep going back and rereading. Radio, it's one shot. So if you say something in a funny way or write something in your script that's confusing and you lose people, and they had just for 3 seconds, they stop either to think about what you said, or they jump in the shower and miss the story that you spent weeks or months working on. It's really, it's very challenging.
Yeah. Calle, I'm so interested about the fact that you are casting actors to play people that you're actually talking to, right? Like sources that you've actually interviewed. Do you set up kind of behind the scenes like a two-way connection? Like are the actors like meeting those people in order to, or do you think it's important to maintain a degree of separation?
I think what's important to say is that I'm not a journalist. Mm-hmm. I'm just a guy who takes the work of journalists and brings that onto stage. And there is a dialogue between the artistic team and the journalists, but of course they protect their sources, but maybe give us some space so we can imagine and get a feeling of how this secret meeting really went. But I myself don't investigate.
Okay. Have you been like reached out to, or had members of your casts reached out to by the people affected or in the stories that you're covering?
Yeah, actually we had sources suddenly in the audience. We had a little talk afterwards who uncovered themselves and said, the person you talked about there, that's me. And I'm so grateful to have a voice here. And that is something really, really inspiring. Also, what you already shared after the performances, at least one journalist of one of the news outlets I work with is there because he or she gets flooded by more information. And that is also something I just really love, that there is an analog live connection that brings the story even further.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Bradley, I'm kind of curious on the subject of like how the work you do affects the people that you're reporting on. Have you had people reach out to you after covering a story and talk about like the way in which specifically, it being on a podcast with such a large audience has impacted them?
Well, I mean, a lot of my career I've been writing about people who do bad things, but I have a kind of fascination by those people, and I actually never judge them for what they've done, and I actually feel bad for them the day before the article comes out or anything comes out. I feel a deep sympathy, and my wife is always saying, "But why do you care so much?" But so I actually tend to have a long relationship with even the subjects of my stories, even the ones that I ruin their life in some way afterwards. And maybe I'm just trying to make up for the impact I've had, but I find that they actually find it therapeutic as well in some way. So, but yeah, there are times when you write about things and people, it changes their life for the worse. But I live by this principle that's an old New York Magazine editor, which is that you never hold your best stuff, no matter the consequences, because you are writing for the public. Like that's the only mandate you have. You're not writing for the individual who was covered, even if they committed a crime, like in your case. You just can't overly worry about that.
Thank you. Sacha, you mentioned a little bit ago, one of the kind of pitfalls or surprises, I guess would be a better term, you experienced transitioning from traditional print journalism to what you're doing now, to the radio and podcast space. I'm kind of wondering, what other surprises, pitfalls have you encountered along that journey?
I think the main ones were the disruption of the gear. As I mentioned, sort of being seen, and maybe this is worldwide, but certainly in the United States, if you're seen or heard, there's some kind of instant celebrity status attached to that, which I always found very odd, especially because I think that the print world to me was the purest form of journalism, the reporters who tended to be the most skilled and the most experienced, yet it's a byline, so most people never think about or never would know who that person is. I think those are the main two.
Yeah. Bradley, I think we should talk a little bit about the economics of podcasting, because you and I both go about it. My stuff is ad supported, and yours is you're kind of working on different ways. How have you found that compared to traditional print journalism?
Well, I think so. Just briefly about our model, which is may give you a heart attack, but it's essentially we are doing stories with the adaptation in mind, and we are very interconnected with the Hollywood portion of it. And the way that we manage that risk is we are the active producer of that project. So we have an element of control. We don't just sort of give it away to someone else. But so the way we think about it is that there's this initial format which has a purity to it, the journalistic version. And then we try to find a partner, a screenwriter or a director who has a genuine connection to the story and a vision for it that's not exploitative, hopefully, and then carry that on. And so that those derivatives can be in the dramatized side, but it could also be, for example, documentaries. And like I said, we try to stay very actively involved in it. So it's a very risky model, to be honest, because it's very difficult to execute this time and again to pull it off. But there is an element of it where one successful project can subsidize some projects that don't work in this manner.
And do you have some kind of legal contract or template that guarantees you the sort of control you want?
Well, I think the way that we think about it is we try to approach things initially where we're like the co-studio or the co-producer. And so every step of the way, it's kind of like jointly decided how this is going to go. So we're both jointly overseeing the screenwriter. And I mean, of course, it can still be a bit wobbly at times.
But picking your partner is really critical.
Yes, exactly. And working closely with the screenwriter, so making sure that they feel empowered. So like a lot of times I work with screenwriters, it's in some ways related to what you do, where I'm actually introducing them to the original people, and I'm making sure they know that there's complexity here. It's not a simple story,
Will you cast people who never meet the people they're playing?
Yeah, definitely. Because it's not about, or there is the danger that you might imitate the people, and it's not about, I don't really have this documentary approach, but I search for the bigger story. As I said, like, for example, we did a play where the little news outlet Dossier in Austria, consisting of 7 people, did their research on the biggest company in Austria, OMV, oil and gas company. And this very OMV tried to, or slapped Dossier, and they almost couldn't make it anymore. And I saw a David versus Goliath story in there, a little news outlet fighting for the good with the strictest journalistic standards Austria has. And I don't want to put individuals there in the spotlight, but the story itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for answering my questions. I think we've got some time to take a few from the audience now.
Thank you guys so much. And actually, we're live streaming this, so we're going to start with a question from someone on the internet. ZCR, not VCR, asks, how do y'all, it's from America, guys. How do y'all relate to the ways podcasting allows information to reach folks who otherwise wouldn't have the time to settle in with text? And they qualify this with maybe the ability or the literacy also. So.
I doubt we're going to disagree that that's a good thing. I think we all agree that's a great thing.
Yeah. One of the things I found beneficial is that you can kind of trick Americans into paying attention to foreign stories. If you get them listening to you every single day or every single week, and you kind of hook them in by reporting on stuff that is directly relevant to their immediate lives, they will follow you when you're, say, reporting on people 3D printing guns in Myanmar or something like that. It's a little bit of a trick, but I've found it very helpful.
Awesome. Yes.
Thank you. So my question is a bit of a two-parter. The first one is investigative journalism, especially something that is incredibly exhaustive and time-consuming. So when you're putting out podcast episodes or writing plays that is essentially based on a timeline of once a week or once every few months or what have you, how do you ensure that you have the story to regularly churn out episodes or regularly put out the content you have to? So that's the first part. Second part is, what impact do you think video, the element of video in podcasting and short form content and clips and TikToks and Reels has had on investigative journalism specifically?
To the first question, basically NPR realizes it can only put out a very small number of serialized podcasts a year, maybe 2, 3, 4, because they are so, unlike interview podcasts, which you can churn out with just a microphone and 2 people talking, the highly produced ones are incredibly labor intensive. So it just means we can do fewer because we tend not to partner with outside companies. That's another way to help, but as we've talked about, risks come with that. The video question is probably better for one of my colleagues.
I mean, in some ways, like, you can only say calamitous, right? Like, the social media in general has had a calamitous impact on people's understanding of the truth and reality. But it also does, like, there are stories that get spread that would not have gotten spread, and facts that get out to people because of the nature of virality. I think probably the most immediate example that I can think of is the filming of the murder of George Floyd, right? That is, and the citizen who filmed that, like, won a Pulitzer, if I'm not mistaken, as a result of, like, the recognition that this was one of the most significant pieces of journalism of that year, So it's one of those things, the downsides, the horrible downsides of social media are something that we just have to endure. It's like a storm, while finding the opportunities that, the way in which things go viral online does present to get truth out to people.
Thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. So I love what you said, Bradley, about never hold your best stuff. And I also wonder if there's a tension between go where there's audience engagement and never hold your best stuff. And I'm wondering, just thinking about the parasocial aspect that you mentioned, has there ever been a time when that relationship worked in the other direction and where the audience sentiment influenced the direction of your reporting? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I spend a lot of time in print journalism working on investigations for a whole year, and then it comes out and there's just not the impact that you were hoping for. So that's why I've become allergic a little bit to pursuing stories that I don't think I can actually have that impact. That's like a choice that I've made, that I'm lucky to be able to make over time in my career. So I think that there is a tension there about never hold your best stuff and doing good journalism, but there's also an overlap as well. And so I'm sort of in search of the overlap at all times. But there's nothing worse than writing an article and then just no one reads it. It happens all the time in journalism. And what was the second part? Oh yeah, the influence part. I mean, probably if I was a better entertainer, I would be more influenced by my audience, but I tend to be very top-down thinking. So to my own detriment, probably.
But how are you deciding maybe something that interests you would not interest a larger audience?
I try not to think too much about, like, the audience at large, but I think about it as myself. Like, I also have attention deficit in this day and age, and I think about what would I want to engage with? Do I actually want to go down the rabbit hole of these details, or do I need to follow a person, or like? So I kind of think about myself first as an audience. Again, probably at my own peril, but that's my guide rather than now what I want to see though is people actually engaging. So then I'll know if I failed or didn't fail based on that.
Just one thing I'd like to add, which is my opinion would be that if you are letting the audience inform the way that you report and tell stories, you've kind of doomed yourself. Like you really can't have it be a two-way street that way. Obviously, you should be accountable, like if you get something wrong. But if you are adapting the way you talk about things and what things you talk because you're scared of scaring away, for example, Patreon backers, you've gone down a very dangerous and dark road.
So an example of what you might withhold to accommodate a certain audience?
For example, you find out that because of the prevalent political beliefs in your community that people are angry about reporting that negatively characterizes something that a group did at a protest or something, right? If you allow that to stop you from reporting on it, then you're starting to commit malpractice.
Hi. I'm Peter York, and I've just written a book about culture wars. And in order to promote it in future, I'm going to be funny. Now, is that a dereliction of duty or not? So the book starts off being funny because it's got brilliant cartoons by Martin Rowson. And inherently, some of the ghastly people I'm describing are also hilarious. Does that occur to you? I know that's a very UK sort of instinct rather than a global one, but we like to nail our devils with funniness.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm interested in everyone else's opinion on this. I was a comedian before I was a journalist. And I've always found that, like, as long as you are being truthful, there's, like, making people laugh is a very helpful way to, like, it's like kind of getting a pill to your dog, right? You wrap it up in a little bit of hot dog or something. But I'm really curious for everyone else's take on that.
Actually, I experienced that something that I don't necessarily see as funny, like corruption, shown on stage, suddenly is hilarious because there are people throwing away all their principles for some money, a jet, a nice trip. And that is something people like to laugh at. I don't try to be funny, but maybe more what you also said, try to be honest about what I think is really interesting. And that, for some reason, turns out to be quite funny sometimes.
I would just add as well that, as a general rule, anyone who's written a book is generally kind of an insufferable person. Because all they talk about is the fact they wrote a book. But I think in your case, you actually had my attention. I actually like listening to you promoting your book, so I congratulate you for that.
Other questions? See one in the back here.
Thanks. I was just wondering if the panel have any thoughts on the boom in true crime and what impact that's having on documentary making and podcasting.
I missed the word, the boom in what?
True crime.
True crime.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of jumped the shark at this point. If I hear about one more true crime podcast.
Well, one of the trends now is non-violent true crime. So we try to specialize in that. But yeah, I think the problem with the true crime epidemic is that it's always about a young woman who goes missing in a field somewhere. And it just makes you feel very cynical and bad about the world, you know? But there's a kind of a pornographic element to that people seem addicted to and that feels exploitative. But the idea of telling a true crime itself is not a problem, but it's just that niche and narrow interest level that makes it a problem. Like if there was more true crime that reflected true crime in the world, you know, the phrase true crime, that might be better actually. There's a lot of true crime that goes on that is a Mexican journalist who's killed by a cartel member or something like that. That's actually meaningful to hear that story, but it's because the obsession is like this sort of very small niche.
I would also add that I think maybe one of the lines there would be, are you covering crime as a journalist investigating a crime, or are you covering crime as a fan of crimes? Right? And if you're doing the latter, I think there's some very obvious downsides to that.
Hi.
So part of my job is thinking about ways to package my team's investigative journalism and make it impactful. So this is really a fascinating conversation. We've spoken a lot about podcasts and something about films. Has there been other formats that you, as a cohort, have found impactful, unfortunately, outside of the theatre? Because in my situation, I'm more curious about that kind of regularity and that way of publishing journalism on a regular basis that has that way to bring an audience in and translate the information in a truthful but also entertaining way.
I think, one thing is if you work in a newspaper, you think everything looks like an article. If you work in the radio, then you think about it as broadcasts or maybe increasingly podcasts. But I think the way to think about it in it's a spectrum. There's no rule for what you're going to produce if someone's going to engage with it. So there's a world in which you can create a very small podcast. Maybe it's 2 or 3 episodes. It doesn't have to always be 10 episodes or something like that. And the cost that comes alongside a 10-part episode is enormous. I'm also very interested in things like graphic novels or even in miniature. Obviously there's the famous Joe Sacco books about Gaza and Palestine. But I think that's also a really interesting derivative format that could perhaps act like a gateway into the product itself. And sometimes when people are cynical about the idea about movies and articles and books, I think about my own experience with the that TV show Dope Sick about the what's it about exactly?
Opioid.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I never engaged with that as an article. I never engaged with it as a book. I engaged with it first as Dope Sick, the TV show, and then I got fascinated. I bought the book, and then I read the articles. So the gateway into the story doesn't have to be, downplaying the importance of it. It just kind of captures someone's attention.
We think about that all the time, and our main solution so far has been multiple types of versions of everything. There is a radio script, then there's a digital story, which is the equivalent of writing a newspaper story after you've bridged in the digital script. Then there's the too long didn't read version of the newspaper script where we tell you here are the 5 takeaways from the long investigative story you may not have been willing to read. So it's really every version that you hope driving people to other versions, which makes our jobs even harder than they already are, but we have to be where people want to be.
We also have a regular show in Vienna, or we had it, that we did every month, where we would just read out the newspaper articles that we were interested in, because there are so many people who don't have there's a paywall, they don't want to pay for that, or they can't pay for that, or the story is just too long. We do that every month with our partner Dossier and a musician, and that is something that costs us nothing. And we made the experience that also bad news is processed way better when you're in a crowd and can talk about it and are not alone in front of your screen or paper.
That's really cool. I would go to that. So going back to podcasts, I guess, one of the things that's so interesting is that as a medium, because of the RSS standard, it's incredibly naive and also resistant at this point to monetization. However, we've seen with stakeholders like Spotify, like Clear Channel, perhaps even, the podcast app in iPhones, et cetera, a reckoning is going to come. What are you thinking of from all of your 3 podcasting perspectives, which are different in scale? How do you resist the enshittification of this great medium?
I mean, that's an everyday sort of like battle, right? I think part of it, like one of the things that I have a lot of issue with when I look at like a lot of what I see on YouTube is these different creators kind of getting into beefs with each other, right? Like, I think that's something you really do have to avoid like the plague. Like, there's a degree to which, especially if what you're doing includes both reporting and editorializing, where your personality is a big part of what you are offering to the audience, right? But you can't let that get into the work that you're doing being about you and like your experience in the story. It has to be about the story. And that's like, I think that's what will make us a work shitty faster than almost anything else.
Well, I think, one of the problems with podcasts is that if every time someone listened to a limited series and they paid $1, that would solve all of podcast problems, Unfortunately, people listen to it and they pay $0. And so it makes podcasters reliant on advertising instead. And advertising they only care if it's a huge number. And even if you have a serial-like podcast, like you said earlier, that is hard to forecast at the time that you need to sell an ad, which is like 3 months before the podcast comes out. So it's very hard to earn enough money from advertising, So podcasts are great in the sense that it's democratized. Like anyone can put out a podcast and it's on all platforms. But the downfall of that is there's no economic alignment with the creation of those, in my opinion.
I'll add one thing. I have a 20-year-old niece who's a junior in college, and she sent me a text last week saying she was pissed off because NPR has a very popular politics called the Politics Pod, and she loves it because she's a political junkie, and they've now created some bonus content where you have to be a paid subscriber. So she was very upset and wanted me to complain to NPR. Her text made me so angry because she went to a Taylor Swift concert this summer, paid an inordinate amount of money, and came home with so much merch. And I sent her this text back that said, it's $39.99 a year to get that bonus podcast, which will grow your brain and make you more informed and more knowledgeable. And if you could spend that money on Taylor Swift, then you're deciding how you want to use your money. And all she came back and said was, well, I'm not going to subscribe anymore. So it didn't work. But a basic problem we all have is trying to convince people of our value. And we, of course, know it's old news that we made a terrible mistake when we began giving things away for free, because once it's free, people don't want to pay for it. But that's the challenge we have, is that it's an expectation it will cost nothing, but it has a cost to make. So we're somehow trying to show people our value. And I don't know that any of us have figured that out yet, but that's the fundamental problem of our business right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's that and the fact that disinformation is always free, right?
Please, last question. Hi, I'm studying a master's in investigative journalism at the minute, but I've got a bit of experience in directing theatre as well. And having just mentioned Dope Sick, my kind of route into finding out about the opioid crisis and the Sackler family was All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, the documentary that was collaborating with Nan Goldin. So I just wanted to ask, what are some more kind of contemporary projects that you feel have adapted journalism in a way that's faithful to the original intention? And on the other hand, what are some contemporary projects that you feel have kind of obscured that intention through the Hollywood instinct? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways I don't really have a problem with most adaptations. Like, I think, some of the ones that I can think of recently, like She Said about the Harvey Weinstein case, I loved watching that film. And even though I was kind of aware of the story, I didn't, religiously read those articles, but I learned a lot from that derivative format. I think in the case of Spotlight, I mean, this is a thing that people still watch today. They're not really probably going and finding the old articles as much, right? So it's a very powerful gateway to journalism over time. It kind of makes it last in a way.
Yeah, I think Spotlight, despite all my fears, ended up being one of the most wonderful tributes to journalism. It gave a morale boost to the industry at a time the industry needed a morale boost, and it was very true to what happened. And I think that's a rarity. I mean, I think about House of Cards, Kevin Spacey, Robin Wright. Of course, the reporter sleeps with somebody. I saw in New York a few months ago, Yellowface, the play. There's a scene that really offended me where this reporter is essentially tricking somebody into talking. And that's the stereotypes of us. And so that's why I have been wary, because that tends to be what people fall back on. So to me, there are fewer, I think, examples of ones where I would say they did our industry real justice and should make us proud, and more they're risky.
Maybe one example from Germany. In January, Correctiv, the news outlet I already mentioned, published a story about fascists that got together in a little house in Potsdam, close to Berlin. Most of them with political ties to the extreme right, and planned the deportation of millions of people there. Correctiv was part of that event undercover and uncovered it in January. A theater in Berlin, I think 3 days after the story was published, made a reading out of it, live streamed that. The state, like the German BBC, streamed it on their website, and out of that, the biggest protest movement in the history of Germany emerged, with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. And I think that's a pretty good example of how, when we also work together, something bigger than us can come out of it.
That's awesome. I think we're out of time. Thank you all for your questions, and mostly thank you all for showing up and participating in this panel.